Silverized Society.
Welcome to the Silverized Society. We are here with another Peasant Radio episode. This episode is important. We're going to talk about a problem. Nerds. Your emotional reaction to the term nerds is part of what we're going to talk about in this episode. I recently became aware that the term nerd is fairly charged for some people. Some people really identify with this term as being positive, and to the degree that the negative usage of this term, which is its original usage, sows discontent in them, throws them off, upsets them even. And that's really interesting to me because it shows a shift in culture. That something that was once negative has now become positive. And that's not always a bad thing, but it does have implications that we should consider. And those implications strangely, perfectly map to Nietzsche's philosophy on civilization and what will be the downfall of it, which is the subverting of values, in a sense that you take this hierarchy and you subvert it. So weakness becomes strength, strength becomes weakness.
Weakness becoming strength is a perfect transition over to me, your co-host, Justin A.W. Blair.
Forgot about you.
I'm here on Peasant Radio, ready to chime in. That's what I do. I chime in.
Chime.
I chimed.
Okay. So we're going to talk about nerds. And it's funny thing because you're actually the one that uses this word more, and I kind of adopted it from you because I thought it was funny, because it's like vintage slang. It's vintage slang to use nerd in its original sense. And I was on a podcast recently where I was speaking about, this podcast is called What Josue Has to Say. You can look it up on my Instagram. The clip I posted popped off because I said, when we have this culture where people are hypersensitive, where they're always looking for offense in jokes and have a really bad attitude. That's really what we're seeing in our culture. It's people with a bad attitude having cultural sway. So suddenly people that don't have a good sense of humor and are easily offended are the ones that are calling the shots and telling us we're bad people for being good-humored and not being easily offended. And I said, that's some nerd shit. That's some nerd shit. To be easily offended at jokes and to look for reasons everywhere you can for getting upset. But it wasn't the message that riled people up. It was the usage of the word nerds. And I thought that was so interesting because it's a perfect example of how our values have changed as a culture. By definition, a nerd is someone who is not cool, someone who lacks certain social skills, someone who does not get along well with the group. And so one commenter, which, hey, I'm not trying to attack this person. I just think that they've presented a perspective to me that is so interesting that I really want to dig into it.
I'm going to just briefly intercede here on a couple of things. First, I'm going to suggest that we don't actually, I don't like to ever respond to a particular person.
I'm not going to name them and give their address or something. I'm just talking about the comment.
I believe it's beneath me and beneath this podcast. So I think you should generalize. However, if you decide to do that, that's your decision. But my aristocratic values do not allow me to speak to plebeians who leave messages on my social media profiles.
You don't have any plebeians leaving messages. So
they're everywhere.
Okay.
They're everywhere. Surrounded by plebeian nerds. Second, briefly, I think that the problem is that you're like nerds. The original nerds. It depends on how original nerd you want to be, because like I don't think there's anything wrong with people that don't fit in into a group. I actually generally tend to gravitate towards those people. And people with a lack of social skills, I'm fine with them for the most part. You seem to be, whatever it is, these people that have bothered you about the use of the word nerd, I feel like all of you are wrong. You're all wrong in a way because you're just defining these different types of groups. I want to reclaim the word nerd and bring it back to its original meaning. But go ahead.
Which is what?
I mean,
was I not using that?
Do you want to know some original word meaning? Because this is a peasant radio episode. Normally we don't do word of the podcast, but it sounds like the need for word of the podcast is ever present, isn't it? Let's briefly look at the origin of the word nerd. 1951, U.S. student slang. This is an informal word of the podcast. Probably an alteration of 1940s slang, nert, N-E-R-T, stupid or crazy person.
That's awesome.
Itself an alteration of nut. The word turns up in a Dr. Seuss book from 1950, If I Ran the Zoo, which may have contributed to its rise. So, nert, N-E-R-T. At the end of this podcast, regardless of where we come down on this, I think there's a way out, a way to bring us all together by potentially bringing back the word nerd as opposed to using the word nerd. But Go ahead. Also, I think you're wrong about Nietzsche a little bit, but you're close enough. Go ahead.
You don't know. So listen.
I do.
I don't think I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying that there's an original usage of the word nerd, which is derogatory. It's meant to...
Stupid or crazy person.
I mean, that's a little bit... That's even farther back. And to the degree that I don't recall that usage at all. I don't recall nerd as ever meaning stupid.
Okay, I'm old enough to actually know that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I was probably on the cusp of where maybe that was changing a little bit. People, a nerd actually had a lot more punch to it back in the day. And it really did mean like the person who like came to school and didn't like take showers. They smell bad. They were maybe there's a whole array of people that might fall into the nerd category. By that time already, I'm not an ancient. I'm not, I wasn't going to school in the 1940s. I wasn't going to school in the 1940s, but still, it wasn't really, that hardcore to be a nerd necessarily. But, it meant people that really could kind of go on that stupid or crazy, still fit into that a little bit,
That's interesting.
It wasn't good. You didn't want to be a nerd.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But that's not what people mean by nerd anymore.
So then why am I in the hot seat for saying people with a bad attitude are a nerd, which is a negative word? And I'm getting some people, it's just a few people, but who cares about the people? There is a view that embodies a cultural change here that views nerd as positive. Forget all the gradations of negative, as positive.
Because these people of your generation, the generation beyond Lost, they were never found. It's not even the Lost generation. The Lost generation was cool. They think of it as Stephen Hawking if he could walk. They think of it as Neil deGrasse Tyson telling them something about the atmosphere of Jupiter at like an 8th grade level. Not Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I mean like this kind of popular science-y kind of... it reminds me of Lego blocks. I don't know why. It reminds me of people that like Legos. The whole aesthetic to me is just Lego things. I don't know why, but that is what it is. It's like... And what's the other guy? There's the other Bill Nye, the crazy guy or whatever. Yeah, that guy. He's like, that's what they mean. They mean like.
I'm gonna scream. You're hijacking the podcast, and I won't allow it. Bill Nye is a symbol of exactly the time in our culture when nerd became cool. Bill Nye was not in that show being the butt of the jokes. Bill Nye was cool, but he was in the aesthetic of a nerd. But here's the thing: it was a shifting view of nerd, right? Because now we were looking at it as nerd who is outside the group, but smart, talented, had something to offer, but just didn't quite fit in with the social customs. That's not what the fuck I'm talking about. Okay.
Okay. And briefly, before you talk about what you're talking about, because it's important, but I do want to get this settled because this is what I think most people thought you meant by it. But there's another major thing, which I think happened, which shifted this, which is that with the rise of computers in the tech industry, you got nerd billionaires. And so now you know, the Steve Jobs or whatever the fuck his name was, that was like a big thing, because and I've never understood this worship of that person at all. But and even what's his fuck, the billionaire now,
Bill
the
Gates.
moon guy.
Oh, Elon Musk.
Well, of course, Bill Gates, but I don't think does anyone really like, but no one ever liked Bill Gates. I mean, he could never even manage cool.
I don't even think Bill Gates is a nerd by definition of the traditional sense. Elon
Musk is who I meant.
Elon Musk is also like not really a nerd by traditional sense. This is the uber nerd. Okay, this is a different kind of person who they don't have a victim complex. They don't have a bad attitude. They are resilient. They don't get on Twitter and cry about jokes and try to shape the world to, uphold their fragile ego. They get the fuck out there and they build shit. They do things. That's not a nerd. Bill Gates is like fucking little girls on an island, okay? Oh, we're going to get this episode pulled. That's not a nerd. Nerd ain't fucking anybody. So this is the problem to me, is this idea that, the shift of the word nerd from something that meant something negative, period. It didn't just mean someone that was smart and didn't get along with those rude jocks. That's not what we're talking about. That's the shift that we have now, right, which maps to the Nietzschean idea of lifting the underdog as some kind of saint, some beacon of goodness by way of their weakness, their status as underdog.
But that's a final thing that I think that the word nerd that isn't the appropriate word for that. So, because first you had people in the 1940s and 1950s, it basically meant someone who was semi-retarded. That's what it meant, or someone who was so extraordinarily outside of the scope of acceptability in a social situation that it was like, I think, a very hardcore, it really meant something negative at that point. Then in the 80s-ish and 90s-ish, especially with computer stuff, it became more of like, okay, yeah, you could be kind of cool though in a way because you were smart. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, it really hit that mark with popular science shows and that kind of thing. Because
but I have a problem. I have to stop you.
Yeah.
Because the people who were semi-retarded didn't stop existing, right? They still exist. They just don't get called nerds. Somehow the archetype of nerd shifted away from the semi-retarded, socially inept, victim complex guy that sat behind you in class and heavy breathed and smelled bad, and shifted to people that just didn't really play by the social rules but were productive and skilled.
Right, but so your argument though about this, what I'm trying to say is the word has stayed the same, but the target of the word has actually changed. And so if we were still talking about the people that were really fucked up, that would be one thing, but that's not what you call a nerd anymore. We don't really have words for people like that because you're not allowed to call people names anymore. But that's ultimately the group of people you're talking about, because you're talking about the people that are like online being afraid, like about violence in video games or something.
Yeah. Weak people with lacking social skills that would lead them to not bathe, etc., to do things that are offensive in public and that people don't understand and find disturbing, and people that have a victim complex. Also, I think that's a important marker of the kind of traditional archetype of nerd that harkens more to this era of 50s, 60s, which is, and you would see this in culture, right? You would see like there's kind of like vengeful spirit, this resentment that is embodied in the nerd. And it's so interesting because so you would have this character that would be inept by their own fault for the most part, or just dealt a bad hand, but then made that bad hand worse by having a bad attitude on top of it. And so they would rightfully be rejected by their peers. And this is the nerd, this outcasted, socially inept individual with a victim complex that blames, it's the hot girl's fault, or it's all the other kids that are laughing and having a pizza party. It's their fault that I'm not cool and included. But then you had that shift where it was, well, actually, it is their fault. and you should be included anyway. And even though you have this kind of like, you are lacking in what makes you a worthwhile contributor to the group. But then we started to merge it, right? We started to imbue this idea of nerd. Well, actually, they do have something to contribute. They just are different. And so that's the shift.
It's because of art. You know what happened is art. It started with people that were, and I mean, to steal man, to give the nerds their due. I mean, there were people, and especially in the past, you know, it's not good to like beat someone or something because they're have a legitimate problem, you know, like,
yeah.
So that's, I'm not endorsing that, but let's just say there were people that were on the losing side of life or whatever, for whatever reason, maybe permanently, maybe temporarily. And then we arc up towards what you get, which is like, say Elon Musk, right? He's a scientist, but he's also a billionaire. That's peak nerd, right? I mean, Iron Man character or whatever, that kind of thing, right? Isn't he like a rich Batman? Although there's thing that you get these figures, because remember, Batman is a millionaire,
But he's a nerd?
Well, yeah, Batman's a
I don't know what you're
terrible
talking
thing.
about.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That was a terrible example.
Yeah.
I don't know comic books and stuff, so I just
Drop
picked
that.
one. Rocket Man or whatever, Iron Man, the guy that's in the iron suit. I don't
he a
fucking
nerd?
know, because I'm not a fucking nerd, so I don't know this, and I also don't watch Marvel movies. Which, by the way, tangent. I think I'm not even gonna say that.
Don't.
Too hot for the internet. And then we arc back down maybe to where the people in the 40s and 50s have now still stayed on this nerd thing, but they're again outcasts and actual losers.
Okay.
That's why it's just complex, because it depends on what generation of nerds we're talking about.
Okay. I want to tie this in now to the Nietzschean idea, because clearly there has been a shift in our view of nerds. Now look, yeah, some of it, let's forget about the original usage where it's like someone that's really screwed. Okay, forget about that. Let's keep it more closer to the contemporary of what people actually would recognize, which is nerd as legitimately derogatory versus nerd as this kind of subversive, cool character that is outside the mainstream in an ideal way. And that change of viewing someone who is outside the norm because of social inadequacies and having the kind of ineptitude in group settings that makes them unlikable. This is important. I'm trying to make these elements stand out as important because they speak to what it means that we now view nerd as positive, often including those very ideas. And I'm not talking about Iron Man or Elon Musk.
I just have
okay?
I don't understand entirely.
Stop. Don't
I really don't
bring up Elon Musk, because no one that is even defending the term nerd as like, oh, it's positive, they're not thinking about Elon Musk. They're thinking about like gamers and like people that like to read fan fiction and are on Tumblr and whatever.
So briefly, but this is why I have a hard time grasping this, is because that I can recall, I don't remember meeting anyone in real life over the last decade or so that is actually like that. I feel like those people what you just described, that they're doing fan fiction on Tumblr.
Oh, dude, you would never meet that person. So scrap that analogy as being useful. First of all, throw that away, because they exist.
That's why it's so hard.
Go on Tumblr. They live there. They're wearing the furry ears. They're doing the thing. They're going to Comic-Con. These people exist. It's a mass community. Get on Twitch if you want to see, a specimen in a live setting. This nerd culture is a thing, and it's actually different from what it originally was, because it's more infantile and less marked by skill. Because there was this, if you go back to like that that era of nerd, there's like a brief moment there where nerd was cooler, right? They were still like socially inept, but they were like making little rockets in their basement or something. That's not even what the fuck it is anymore. Like real people that like identify with nerd culture, they just play video games and read fan fiction. Like they're not building tech stuff. Like the people that are actually building tech, I don't think they really call themselves nerds or identify with nerd culture per se. You know, these are people that are, again, doing things, successful, tend to not actually have that kind of like hypersensitive fixation on social issues. That's different.
Right, but so and now I'll have to make an admission, a slight admission, is that I feel like I have engaged in activities that are nerdy to some degree. Like I read fantasy books,
but without being
a
nerd, right? You see this. You can do nerd things, and this is why I had a problem with this comment, because it's like we need to divorce out some of the qualities that we've imbued as being archetypally nerdy, like reading books or being introspective and shy. Like those things are not inherently nerdy because they're not derogatory. Nerd is a derogatory word. Thus, the things that must mark it, the central elements of nerd must be negative, not positive things that we've imbued into it through time.
Right, but I think this is what has thrown me off is that I don't agree with the idea that, so I think reading books is a good idea and being intelligent is a good idea and all those kinds of things. And I think you can engage to a degree with things that might have been considered traditionally nerdy, like books about dragons or Star Trek or whatever it is, even though... Okay, so I've seen this happen, though, within those... Okay, there's a couple things. First off, there are degrees. So I have read many books about dragons. I'm joking, but kind of about dragons. But I've read a fantasy, not fan fiction, by the way. That's different. That is for a different class of people.
Nerds.
That's what I'm having a problem with, is calling them nerds.
You have a positive identification with nerd too.
No, because what it really is they're complete social rejects. That's what you mean.
That's what nerd was originally meant to convey.
I know. But there is the problem with this arc of the meaning is that there's no real good word for that era there where it became acceptable to not be like a dumb jock or whatever, right, from the 80s or whatever, but also it didn't mean that you like
were inept,
dressed up like a furry or whatever it is that people do now that they do. That's not good either. That's not good.
Yeah, but do you even need a word for that? Because it's like that's just healthy. Being in neither of those extremes is actually just being healthy, reading books and working out. Being introspective and, still getting along with people. That's just healthy.
But see, this is where the age difference is something that you should understand. That was when I was younger, and also even before me, of course, like there was this sense of like, oh, you're reading a book, you're dumb. And, someone knocks the book out of your hand or whatever because you can read. So that's where I get a little touchy about that, because I don't think that needs to be captured and kept good.
But that's the other
I think
extreme.
What you're talking about, and I've seen this happen, and then you can talk about that thing about Nietzsche or whatever. What happened is that some of and there's thousands of different types of communities. I hate that word. Communities based around pop culture phenomena, Star Trek, whatever it is. It's not really so much Star Trek anymore, but pick Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, whatever, Marvel
whatever
shit.
It is, right? And so that does tend to attract the people that like go to the conferences and like get really into it and that kind of stuff, like really, really, really devoted to it. And not even all of those people at all, because there are still people that are just obsessed with a certain thing that aren't deranged completely. But it does tend to collect marginalized people. People that have thrown themselves into a thing because real life is hard. And it seems to have now also, and you see this now in things like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, all this kind of stuff. Now on top of that, you also have all this political stuff, which I think is maybe what you're kind of getting at a little bit more.
Well, accidentally, actually, because you're edging into that, but there's a discussion that needs to be had about the seeping in to, nerd culture of leftist politics, because that wasn't, I don't recall that being like politics at all being a part of nerd culture, but it speaks to the fact that these are people that are on the fringes traditionally, that are somehow, view themselves as being in this underdog position, and anti the norm, the status quo, in a kind of victimized way, that these kind of politics, this idea, inclusive, progressive, safe space and trigger words, all of that is seeping into this nerd culture space now. And hey,
but it's seeping into everything, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing where it's like, I don't know that this is the root
certain
of that
spaces
anymore.
are particularly marked by their adoption of those ideas, right? So
Feels like everything is.
yeah, I mean, you can make that
at this point.
argument. I would say that there are things that are not, like farming. Maybe
There probably
woke
is,
farmers.
man.
Well, there's going to be a subset. There's going to be a subculture. But I think some communities that are centered around an interest are going to be more prone to adopting certain ideals, political ideals. So whatever. We're out of time now because the Zoom is victimizing me. So let's tie it into I don't know. It's hard because we've spent a lot of time.
10 more minutes.
We spent a lot of time trying to pin down the change in definition of the term nerd and what that points to in terms of larger cultural change. And look, here's a point I want to make. Final point for this is that I think there's a problem that people don't consider when you subvert ideas and idolize different values. And this is not to say that the other extreme is positive, right? The jock that knocks the book out of your hand, that's not the ideal man either. That is the other extreme. It's very perfect yin and yang almost of two extreme opposites of each other. You don't want to be either of those. Me saying that I don't want to idolize, nerd culture is not me saying that I want to idolize jock culture. But the thing about this idea of nerd now as being something positive is that you end up with a value framework that idolizes values that may not be actually conducive to a healthy life. So this is, to me, the interesting thing is like, what does it mean for a culture that views a word that is originally used as derogatory as indicative of something entirely positive? So if nerds are cool, then what is not cool? What is not cool from that? Like, is going to the gym, having friends, having, a physical side to your life, being charismatic and socially competent, being cooperative? Are those things not cool now? And so there's a danger in idolizing what was once viewed in a negative way, because you can end up subverting your own values to the point that you're pursuing something that you think is positive because of the associations you have with it now that were imbued in by your culture. But I worry that it still symbolizes a lacking, because I don't see nerd as an identity, as like some equal but opposite identity, because then that would mean jock is one too. Is there positive jock? I don't think so. I don't think someone that's like, I eschew books and all I do is hang out in the gym and I think it's actually cool to dominate people if they're weak. Like, are you going to start imbuing positive associations into that in the same way that has been done with nerd? And would that be a positive thing? It, in a way, there's a weird like right-wing, left-wing thread that runs through this like idolization of nerd, idolization of the jock. Because there is like this growing trad movement, and I don't say that it's just emblematic of all the trad movement, but there is this kind of like idea of go back to the Athenian man or whatever. And I could see how the same thing could play out with the jock archetype as it has with the nerd, where it becomes the subversive thing and actually it's cool. And then you would see the danger in that. So if you cannot see the danger in lifting nerd up, something once derogatory is now positive, then perhaps you can see it if the same pattern plays out with the term jock.
Yeah, well, there's something here. I'm not sure that we quite got it right, but there is one thing maybe, is that there isn't one culture anymore, and there's never been one culture in this country. I mean, obviously there's been different cultures, different types of people, different places, whatever. But this is what I think, putting on my futurist hat, and I've said this before, there's going to be more and more of this confusion about terms, about words and all that kind of stuff, because there isn't even close to a set agreed upon standard of what conduct should be for people anymore. And there's no set standard for what a culture should be anymore. And there's 10 billion different channels about every special interest in the world on top of that. So just be prepared to be confused. Like, because there's some part of me, especially as I'm older and all that stuff, also, I hear you talk about like, there's a trad thing and there's a this and that and all that stuff. And it's like, all this is just things on the internet that people see and then make up in their brains. Like, you know, like there's a real lack of, in real physical space, I feel like, people playing out these identities. But
for now.
Well, maybe it's just different, like you said before. Maybe it's just I'm not around people where this would
true.
Be.
Do you want to briefly
I'm not around.
Give the Nietzschean, like, just an explanation of how this would relate to Nietzsche? Like, I'm not saying don't make the connection, just put out the Nietzschean idea of like devaluing strength and whatever.
Well, I don't think you're right about that. So I can't make your case. I think
I'm not
it's
saying
wrong.
to make my case.
You said something about this playing into the last man idea, but that's not entirely right, because the last man idea is the idea that...
I didn't say it played into the last man idea per se. I'm saying it's the idea of subverting values, which is what Nietzsche criticized, this idea of Christianity specifically, that you uplift weakness and meekness and the underdog, and then what do you get with a culture that uplifts the lowest rung of people, the underdog, the meek, as being those who are, you know, the highest. That's the idea. I'm not saying it specifically maps onto any one part of the concept, but more that dynamic of subverting values, like flipping them. I mean, that's literally what it is. That is, you're taking a term, nerd, that is derogatory and flipping it, subverting it, so that it is actually, we're supposed to believe, cool now. That is exactly that. That is taking the underdog and saying, no, this person is actually the one that is, you know, ideal.
So I see why we have this weird disagreement that we're not even sure where we're disagreeing about. But I think it comes down to what you just said, because the way you characterize that, I don't agree with. Because what I think happened was the people the word nerd was talking about changed for a while. And the reality is, Elon Musk isn't a nerd because he's a rich person who's successful. That isn't what a nerd was in the 1950s, and it's not what you're talking about as it being now, which is just like people that wear rabbit ears or something on the internet. I don't even fucking know what that is exactly, but whatever that is, that's not a billionaire successful person, right? That's just not. And this is where that's because I don't see what you're saying happened isn't exactly what I think happened. What happened was the word kept being used, and it just identified a certain type of person in the 50s, and then around the 90s, 2000s, it actually was used to identify. It was a trick. They're pod people nerds. Elon Musk wasn't actually a real nerd. Like comic book people, superheroes or whatever, that fly in space or whatever. I think that's Iron Man. I don't know what Iron Man's about. But anyway, the point is that also wasn't a nerd. Those were just smart people that were successful. To some degree, those people probably took on that term, took it for themselves as cover to a degree. And then now we have this other thing, which is just like depressed people wearing rabbit ears. So that is a nerd, but my whole thing is that it's just changed. The word didn't change, but it's confusing because it hit in time. The person it was referring to changed status.
Well, we don't have any more time to go into the topic and to tie in more of the Nietzschean philosophy to it, though I would like to. Perhaps we will do a part 2. But I think that we have dealt with one of the major issues in our culture right now, which is the changing definitions of words, particularly of values that are attached to those words, and how confusing that is when one person views something as negative that the other views as positive. So if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode.
See you later, nerds.
Nerds.